So last time we left off talking about George Washington attempting to get credit for the United States government. He does this by doing what? Can someone remind the class? How does he do this? How do you grow credit? If you guys want to grow credit, what do you have to do to get credit?
You have to have debt first.
You have to have debt and a history of paying off that debt. And so in this case, Alexander Hamilton advised the national government to absorb the debt of the various states, much of it incurred during the Revolutionary War, to the national government. And the national government would have to pay this off. But in order to pay this off, the government needs what?
Money.
Money. And how does the government get money, Holly?
Taxes.
Taxes. And so the American way is to tax the vices. And the vice here, of course, is whiskey. I mentioned before, people back then, they drank whiskey, a lot of whiskey. Like the average grown male drank 6 gallons a year. That's a lot. And so that means you're going to tax people, specifically the farmers that make the corn, which make the whiskey. And don't sing the rest of the song, please. And so he puts a tax on the whiskey, and this leads to a riot. Now, of course, George Washington, being George Washington, just simply calls on the great American military, which has a great tradition of fighting, and they just marched right in there and put the farmers down, right? Shake your head. No, they did not. In fact, we didn't have an army. If we got attacked by a foreign nation, that probably wouldn't go so well for us. You know what I mean? And so George Washington had to call on local militias in order to put down the farmer uprising, which he did. It showed strength of George Washington, but not so much for the government, which is going to lead us to looking forward to actually starting to build something of a military. This happens primarily in the administration of whom? Does anybody know whose administration we really grow our military in, and especially our Navy?
Jefferson.
Good guess, but no, it's really John Adams. He's the one who actually, when I say grow our Navy, I think we go from 0 boats to like 4. So, relatively speaking, right? When, you know, yeah, so still pretty small. One of George Washington's major goals in his presidency was to avoid political parties. He thought that parties were damaging for a polity or for a government. And so he wants to avoid this political infighting, and our Constitution was actually developed with the idea to keep parties from really happening. Did that work? Or do we have political parties today? Well, I'll just let you know. I saw a few of you shake your head. By the way, feel free to nod. You guys are you're on camera. You're on candid camera. You're on video. You're going to be on the internet. Okay. So if you sit there looking like a bum, you're going to look like a bum online for everyone to see. So you can nod, you can shake your head, you can raise your hand when I ask for audience participation. You can do this. You're recommended to do this. So yeah, there you go. So once again, we do have parties in the United States. And do we have lots of parties in the United States or very few parties in the United States?
Well, we have a lot, but there's 2 main ones.
We have 2 main ones, and actually we don't have, in comparison to other sort of democracies that are out there, we don't have a lot compared to them. We've got like the Republicans and the Democrats, right? Those are the 2 main ones. And then today we've got like the Green Party that gets 2% of the vote, and then the Libertarian Party that gets like 1% of the vote, and then that's all. When the United States sets up nations around the world, believe it or not, and we have, they call it nation building. We have built nations around the world. Do we basically transplant our Constitution to these new nations that we build? You can nod or you can nod, or maybe you don't know. Do we or don't we? I guess you guys don't know. We don't. Most of the nations that we build do not have the sort of political weirdness that our Constitution has. When we build nations around the world, we almost always borrow the British parliamentary model. Did you know that? We don't borrow our own model, we borrow a parliamentary model. We tried to avoid parties by avoiding the parliamentary model when the United States was created with the Constitution. It wasn't successful. It wasn't successful under George Washington. It hasn't been successful after George Washington. So why would a parliamentary model, how many of you are familiar with the parliamentary model and how that works? Anybody? Okay. So, and by the way, if I had my choice of types of government, I would pick hands down parliamentary model over our own model. Speaking purely from like a political scientist perspective. The way that works is this: rather than voting for people, the people vote for, rather than individuals, you vote for parties. And so if you like the Republican Party, you would vote for the Republican Party. Or if you like the Democratic Party, you'd vote for the Democratic Party. How many of you agree either, like I'm talking like almost 100%, with either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? You're like, yep, I'm all in with one of those two. Yeah, nobody. Here's how parliamentary models work, though. If, say, 30% of the population votes for the Republican Party, and let's say 20% vote for the Democratic Party, okay, that's fine. But then there's room for other parties here, because the proportionality of the popular vote is represented in Parliament. So if 30% goes to Republican, that means 30% of the people in Parliament are chosen from the Republican Party to represent the Republican Party's interests in Parliament. If the Democrats get 20%, then the Democrats would have 20% of the seats in Parliament. And what that allows for then is, if you don't like the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, you can now vote for, say, the Green Party. If you like the Green Party, you think that's great. Go Ralph Nader, go the Prius. You know, we love Priuses. It's great cars. You could vote for that. And so then all of a sudden the Green Party, rather than getting 2% in the pot in the vote, would now all of a sudden maybe get what? Like 12% or 15% or maybe more, because they actually would then have people in Congress that represent their party. Did you know in most European countries there's actually like Christian parties? In almost every major European country, there is a party that's called like the Democratic Christian Party, or just simply like the Polish Christian Party. And you can go vote for them, and they get that percentage of the vote. You know, so 30% of the votes go to the Polish Christian Party, and then in their parliament, there you go. They get 30% of the seats. Now you might say, well, how do you get a president? Or for the parliamentary model, what do you call the president? What do you call that person? Anybody know? So in Great Britain, do they have a president?
They have the prime minister. Okay.
Yes. And so the prime minister is kind of looked at as the head of government in their country. And so how would that happen if you have like no party with the majority? Well, the way it works is this: in a parliamentary model, you'd have, say, like the 30% Republicans we were talking about. In order to form a government, they have to compromise with some of the other parties and agree on a prime minister and agree on an agenda. So once Parliament comes together, that 30% of Republicans would then maybe join with the 10% of the Christian Party and 5% of this other little party and 3% of this other little party, and they would form a coalition government. And from there, they would elect a prime minister, they would elect a prime minister, and they would also set an agenda. How many of you think that's better? How many of you aren't sure? How many of you are like, American, keep the Constitution? That's fine too, by the way. What that allows, though, for is different perspectives to emerge. Rather than simply having two parties controlling everything, it would allow for other viewpoints to emerge in government. Does that kind of make sense? And so that's why you would want to have a parliamentary type of a model. It allows for that. Now, George Washington thinks parties at all are bad. And so he tries to unite everyone under his government. He does this by calling Jefferson back from France. Jefferson was known for having liberal views at the time, and Hamilton was known for having pretty conservative views at the time. Can someone tell the class when we say conservative and liberal here at this time, what does that mean? I guess I'll just,
Tradition
Holly.
versus pushing forward.
What was that? I didn't hear all that.
Conservatism is tradition, and being liberal is trying to push forward.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So Jefferson was for more change than Hamilton was. So let's talk about the difference here between Jefferson and Hamilton, or Hamilton and Jefferson. They disagreed on a lot of different things. Now, both of these were, you know, if you were to go back to the terminology we were using before, right? Federalist versus anti-federalist when the Constitution was coming into existence. Hamilton was a Federalist. Madison would have been a Federalist. John Jay Jefferson probably would have been a Federalist if he had been here. Because the Federalist was in favor of what? Versus an anti-federalist. Someone tell me.
The Constitution.
Yeah, the Constitution, and the anti-federalists wanted to keep what? Somebody else.
Articles of Confederation.
That's right, the Articles of Confederation. Now we're moving into the 1790s, where so we're taking those terms and kind of pushing them back. Now Federalist is going to mean something different, okay? A Federalist is going to be someone who is now in the party of Hamilton, and a Democratic Republican, or originally a Republican, then a Democratic Republican, and then just simply a Democrat later, it would be the party of Jefferson. And so at the time, Hamilton was considered to be a lot more conservative than Jefferson. Why? Hamilton liked the British way of doing things. Hamilton liked the British economic system. Obviously, that makes him conservative because America had been what? British.
Right.
Jefferson, on the other hand, was not a big fan of Great Britain. In fact, he absolutely hated Great Britain. During the Revolution, he said he would be glad to lend his hand to sink the entire Isle of Great Britain into the ocean. Jefferson, by the way, very, very interesting guy, and maybe not who you would expect. He's absolutely like philosophically brilliant. How many of you know someone who's like brilliant, but also when it comes to practical stuff, totally stupid? Anyone know people like that? Yeah, there are people like that, and Jefferson was exactly like that. So financially, his own financial records were a total mess. Like he was a financial disaster, but he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Like how do you make sense of that? And so he was one of those guys who was very, very impractical, at least when it comes to his own life. But when it comes to political philosophy, quite brilliant. He was also very tall. The average height for a man back then was about 5'5" or 5'6". Jefferson was 6'3", so he was very tall, almost as tall as George Washington, who was 6'4". Thomas Jefferson was, if you took off the wig, like bright red-headed with freckles. I'm sure the painter didn't paint the freckles because Jefferson probably didn't want that. And he was also incredibly shy. You put Thomas Jefferson into a room of 50 people, he'd be the guy in the corner saying not a word. He never gave speeches, ever. To know Jefferson, you have to read his letters or talk with him quietly in the corner. He might say a few words to you, but probably not. We'll call him the uber introvert. Does that kind of make sense? Like, get a couple of friends around him and he would open up and he would talk. But other than that, he was very, very quiet, which is maybe not exactly what you would expect. Washington was a very, very tall guy. He was a guy who was not politically smart, but he was a very honorable person. He was very concerned with honor. And so when we get into Washington's presidency, the vast majority of what Washington releases in terms of speeches or writings, guess who writes it for him? He doesn't write hardly any of it. Anyone know? It's Hamilton. He's very, very close to Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton becomes a very, very close aide to him back in the Revolutionary War. They remain close during the 1780s. And in the 1790s, yeah, George Washington picks Hamilton and puts him right in the middle of his cabinet as Secretary of the Treasury. Very clearly, the federal government's going to be a lot more powerful if the federal government has debt, because that gives the government also credit. And Alexander Hamilton is behind this. He wants to make the national government very strong. Jefferson, though being the liberal, believes in what? A weak national government and a stronger state government. Does that kind of make sense? This is how Jefferson is different than Hamilton. Hamilton likes the British. Jefferson likes whom?
The French.
The French. He'd just been there in France. He supported the French Revolution beginning in 1789. Jefferson thought this was great. People like Adams and Washington and Hamilton, they were horrified at what was going on in France during the French Revolution, right? You've got these crazy revolutionaries running around, breaking the prison open, setting the prisoners free, running amok, which, by the way, there's some people arguing for that these days. It's weird. Anyway, not saying anything here or there. You have King Louis. What happened to King Louis's head? It was removed from his body, and his wife and his little kid. Yeah, kind of sad. And Jefferson is like, yeah, you know what he said? He said, this is good. He says that a revolution every 20 years was good for the soil. He said stuff like this. He said the tree of liberty should be stained from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Yeah, that's not Hamilton's attitude at all. Hamilton's like, what are you talking about? We need calm. We need normalcy. And so you have a very pro-British versus a very pro-French attitude within the Washington administration itself. Okay. When it comes to the way that the government's going to work, clearly Hamilton is very in favor of having a stronger national government. He's very in favor of having the government be in charge of money. Jefferson doesn't really like this. Hamilton also wants to see with money, what's the best way for a nation to become wealthy? Is it through agriculture or is it through industry?
Industry?
It's industry. So Hamilton wants to see industry really start to grow in the United States. Thomas Jefferson is absolutely horrified by this. Why do you think Thomas Jefferson believes that industry will end democracy? Can anyone figure out why Thomas Jefferson would think that industry would end democracy? Okay, imagine this. If you are not a farmer who owns your own land and controls your own destiny, and you are instead a worker, you work for some company or some industry, and you go down to vote, and there's your boss. There Mr. Villers is, sitting there in the Grange Hall where I'm planning on voting. And he's leaning against the counter right next to the ballot box, and he says, hey, Joe, I want you to vote for this person. Now, Mr. Villers is the guy who pays me. How much freedom do I really have in those circumstances to vote my conscience? See the problem with this? When you have industry, you have people who are beholden to their employers. And those employers can interfere with how they vote. This is what Jefferson is really afraid of. So Jefferson's vision for America is dramatically different than Hamilton's. Hamilton wants to see America as an industrial stronghold with a strong central government, with banking being run by the central government. And Thomas Jefferson wants to see America expand from sea to shining sea, with individual white dudes owning large chunks of land where they are completely beholden to no one but themselves. And only then can democracy flourish. See how different they are in their views. Okay, so once again, the Federalist, now meaning something that it didn't mean like 3 years before this, they're a party which favors a strong central government. They favor business, they favor industry, they favor federal banks. And by the way, Alexander Hamilton from the great state of New York, although he was originally born in the West Indies, I believe, insisted that the government put its deposits in a federal bank. These federal banks were not owned and operated by the government itself, but yet they were privately owned and operated, with the government placing their deposits in the bank that is basically operated by bankers. And of course, he favored Great Britain. by the way, today we have a Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is in no way controlled by private industry, but is rather controlled by a group of people who are chosen by our government. And the Federal Reserve is a government agency. So today that is not the way that it was then. That's going to get to be especially problematic in the Andrew Jackson era, in about 30, 40 years after this, when the federal bank is being operated by a guy named, privately, by a guy named Nicholas Biddle. And Andrew Jackson decides he hates Nicholas Biddle, and he keeps all the federal funds from being put in the bank, and it bankrupts the whole bank. Yeah, very interesting, but that's on down the line. Jefferson, on the other hand, we'll call him a Democratic Republican just for the sake of this not being too confusing, right? But he called himself a Republican, and his followers called himself a Republican. Remarkably here, the Federalists, Alexander Hamilton and John Adams and George Washington and John Jay and some other important names that you should be familiar with. Later, really important Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, who will be very much in charge of coming up with the idea of a federal review, judicial review, which we'll talk a little bit about later. They're all Federalists. Now, the guy who wrote the Constitution, who was once called a Federalist, his name was what?
James Madison.
Yes, James Madison, the father of the Constitution. Now he joins Jefferson's party and becomes a Republican, or a Democratic Republican. So how many of you have all that straight in your head? You got it all figured out? Got it all straight? Kind of. How many of you are like, there's just too many different names and it's all bouncing all over the place? Okay. Well, hopefully we can get it all sorted out. Maybe making kind of a list of these things might be useful. Okay. So George Washington wants to unite everyone. And instead, by bringing Jefferson and Hamilton both into his cabinet, they get to fight basically every single day. Humorously, of course, George Washington sometimes, who had an explosive temper, you wouldn't really think of that when you look at his picture on the dollar bill. Oh, by the way, if you look at the picture on the dollar bill, it's kind of funny. George Washington, by the time he was president, which was when that painting was done on the dollar bill, he had no teeth. Well, he had one tooth. And around that one tooth, they actually created a false teeth to fit around the one tooth. But then because it would be in there, like moving around that one tooth, so eventually it was carved out of ivory. But before that, they tried cow's teeth. George Washington, when he was young, apparently had Brazil nuts imported, and he would crack them with his teeth. Well, his teeth eventually all fell out, except for the one that kind of had the teeth all sitting around it. And so, because he looked really funny with that, I guess. So during the painting of the picture, if you look at the dollar bill, if you have one right now, take it out, look at it. You'll see that his mouth looks all puffy. Well, the reason is because he had no teeth, and the painter, I think Gilbert Stuart might have painted that particular picture, basically had him shove his mouth full of cotton to kind of like make it look somewhat more normal, but now his mouth looks puffy. So anyway, there you have it. On the dollar, he's got a puffy mouth. But George Washington wants to unite these people, and in his, when he'd have a cabinet meeting, sometimes you get so angry that he'd be screaming at Jefferson and Hamilton. Like I said, he had a bit of a temper. And at one point, his private secretary wrote this down. He's like, the general is very angry today, Vice President, very angry today. Apparently, he took off his hat that he was wearing and then threw it down on the ground, yelling at Hamilton and Jefferson, jumped up and down on it and started cussing at him like a sailor. So yeah, can you imagine George Washington doing that? Kind of funny. Anyway, both these two men ended up leaving the cabinet post before their end of the term. Jefferson was like, I just can't take it anymore. No one agrees with me. Life's so hard. I'm going back to my home of Monticello, back to be around my books and my crops and my slaves, where I can redesign my house 5 different times over the course of my life, have my slaves tear it down and rebuild it. Yeah, I mean, how many have been to Monticello? Have you been to Monticello? Okay, it's out in the middle of nowhere in Virginia. Anyway, there's Jefferson. Hamilton has other problems. Anyone familiar with what Hamilton's problems are during the administration here? Well, he's got several different problems. The biggest one is the one where anyone listened to the Hamilton musical. So here, guys, I'll give you 5 total extra credit points if you go watch it again now that we've walked through this. Just tell me you watched it. 5 whole extra credit points. So it's not an extra assignment like 5 out of 5. I'm talking about like 5 out of 0, meaning 5 points added on to everything else if you go and you watch the Hamilton play there it's on the Disney Channel. So if you have Disney Plus, you can watch Hamilton. So there you go. It's an assignment for extra credit if you would like to watch it. It's completely on you. Let me know if you watch it. In the musical Hamilton, which you now can watch if you would like, it talks about this. There's a woman named Maria Reynolds. How many of you have listened or heard the?
Not the Reynolds pamphlet.
Yes, the Reynolds pamphlet. So pretty remarkably, it's really messed up. I mean, you talk about messed up. So James Reynolds, I believe was his name, was husband to Maria Reynolds, and he was like, "Hey, see that guy? He's Secretary of the Treasury. Go have an affair with him." And so she's like, "Okay." Apparently, she was very beautiful. And keep in mind, of course, that Hamilton too was married. In fact, his wife, really interesting. So if you read the beginning of the book Hamilton by Ron Chernow, which is pretty boring, by the way, but the beginning's interesting because it starts out in 1860, the beginning of the Civil War. Hamilton's wife was still alive then. Not Maria Reynolds, but his actual wife. Anyway, that's beside Maria Reynolds. So she starts sleeping with Hamilton. They're having this affair. And then after a while, her husband's like, "And now let's try to blackmail him. I hear you're sleeping with my wife. Pay me money." And Hamilton's like, "But I really like sleeping with your wife. Can I keep sleeping with your wife if I keep paying you money?" And he's like, "Yes." Yeah. Good times. Yeah. So when you think about that, that makes Maria Reynolds a what? When her husband's like, "Yeah, provided Hamilton keeps paying us, you can keep sleeping with her." What does it make her?
A prostitute.
What does that make him? James Reynolds makes her his pimp. Like, what? Talk about messed up. Super messed up. Yeah. So anyway, when you're blackmailing the Treasury Secretary, that's not good. You know, when the Secretary with the Treasurer is paying you money so you can keep sleeping with his wife, that's not good. And so Hamilton, of course, has to leave his office as well, but he doesn't go anywhere. He stays around, and he's always there around George Washington, influencing George Washington's ideas. Meanwhile, of course, Jefferson goes back to Monticello, and there he is until he's elected vice president under Adams. He comes back and he's like, "Oh, it's too hard. I don't like this." And Adams is like, "Please don't go away. I like you. You're my friend." And Jefferson's like, "Yeah, but we're in different parties, and I'm going back home to Monticello to be with my books, my crops, and my slaves." So there you have it. There's a preview of the Jefferson to come. He actually really doesn't like to hang around in the Capitol, whether it's in Philadelphia or later in Washington, D.C., until he has all the power. Anyway, whatever. Continuing. As you probably noticed when we talked about the Whiskey Rebellion, the United States was not really in a place to defeat a bunch of crazy, angry farmers. How well do you think we would go up against the British or the French? Well, the British and the French like to fight each other. They hate each other clear until World War I, well-ish. And then after that, they've kind of been friends, but they still like to badmouth each other. So it's good. They have a good relationship now. It's like they're enemies that are now kind of friends. Back in 1793, France and Britain ended up fighting again, even with the revolution going on in France. And so the guy that had started the revolution, one of the guys named Robespierre, by this point he had kicked the bucket. Well, someone more like it kicked his bucket, and he was dead. And so a new guy had come to power. His name was Talleyrand, and Talleyrand sends the ambassador. He sends a guy to be the ambassador to the United States as an official guy here. His name was Citizen Genet, right? So democracy for all, we're all brothers, and this sort of stuff from the French Revolution. Citizen Genet. He shows up in America, and rather than sitting down and having a meeting with George Washington off the bat, he starts going around fostering anti-British sentiment by starting pro-French clubs. By the way, if an ambassador from any country in the whole world shows up here and did this and be like, hey, here's the Chinese ambassador. Oh, what's he doing? He's setting up like pro-Chinese groups and anti-European groups. That sounds good. No, that would not go over well. And this is exactly what he was doing. And he encouraged American sailors to seize British ships on the high seas. And Americans were like, yeah, we like the French. Ooh, we hate the British. But George Washington's trying to keep peace with both nations. If we have a hard time putting down angry farmers, what's going to happen when we fight the British? Not good. And so when the American sailors started basically capturing British vessels, that made the British mad. They were already mad. The British already didn't like us. Remember, we just fought a war with them, right? They didn't like us to begin with. And then we received Citizen Genet as the ambassador. They didn't like that because they didn't consider the French government to be legitimate. And we probably shouldn't have considered it to be legitimate either. Anyway, we did. And then Citizen Genet showed up and told George Washington that George Washington was a fool and that the American people would command him to support the French. And George Washington was like, goodbye. So what happens? Well, we come very, very close to starting a war with the British, largely because of people like Citizen Genet. And the Jeffersonians were very pro-French, anti-British. And so the Jeffersons, they're good with fighting a war, even though we don't have much of a military, with the British. And so Hamilton and Washington called upon Chief Justice John Jay, who had been one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. He was also now a Federalist as well, as a political party Federalist, and sent him to England and said, here, fix this. And so he drew up this treaty with kind of the direction of Hamilton and whatnot, and went to England. England didn't really want to have a war with us either at the moment. And so they were able to come to an agreement with the Jay Treaty. And it normalized relationship between Great Britain and the United States. It was actually a pretty good treaty. But Americans, popularly speaking, I'm not talking about within the government, but just regular Americans, how did they feel about the British? We had just fought a revolution against the British a few years before. Americans didn't love the British. Americans hated the British. And who helped us win at Yorktown?
The French.
The French did. So why would we be siding with the British against the French? See the problem? So when Jay got home, he said this, and of course it's a bit of an exaggeration. He's speaking with hyperbole. You guys know what an effigy is? You know what an effigy is? How many of you know what an effigy is? Okay. So if you don't know what an effigy is, it's a depiction of a specific individual that you basically publicly kill. So you take a stuffed person, right? So you say, this is John Jay, and I'm going to light him on fire and burn him to death, right? And you'll have a little parade, okay? So that's called burning someone in effigy. John Jay noted when he got home from Britain with his Jay Treaty, it was named after him, even though, it was, a lot of people had their hands in it. He said that he could steer his course from one end of the states to the other, from like Massachusetts down to South Carolina, by the light of his own burning effigies. He was not popular. And for a while, Washington wasn't particularly popular with this either. But this is a major success for Washington's administration. It helps keep the United States out of a war we could not have afforded to fight. And so the Jay Treaty, it made France angry, and it made the Jeffersonians angry, and it made a lot of regular Americans angry. But what it did do, put off war with England, so we weren't going to go to war. In fact, it made the French so angry that pretty soon we're going to be very close to fighting a war with the French. Yeah, that's kind of the other side. Made the French so mad that in Adams' administration, we spend the majority of the time basically at war with France without actually having to fight the French. We'll talk about why that's the case. And so we do have a better relationship with England after this, at least for a little while. Okay, And then finally, Washington's presidency ends with the farewell address. Alexander Hamilton had a major hand in this. As long as Washington was in power, Hamilton had some power. When Adams comes to power, Adams dislikes Hamilton very strongly, even though they're in the same party. And Adams is actually a lot friendlier towards Jefferson. Though Jefferson also isn't very friendly towards Adams because Adams is in the wrong party. So Adams has no friends, right? John Adams has very few friends. So Hamilton is helpful in creating this. And then once George Washington dies, Hamilton has very little power. He comes up with this kind of crazy idea in the early 1800s to have like a pro-Christian constitutional party emerge. And then the vice president of Thomas Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr, shoots and kills him in 1804. So Hamilton doesn't make it all that long. He gets shot and killed by the vice president. And you guys might be wondering, but yeah, our vice presidents, most of them don't shoot other people. In fact, we didn't have one vice president shoot another person clear until George W. Bush is vice president. George W. Bush's vice president, Dick Cheney, actually shot someone while he was vice president. He was hunting birds, and he accidentally shot some 80-year-old guy in the face. But don't worry, it was a long ways away. He only had like 15 pellets in his face that they had to dig out. And the guy was okay. But I remember the late night comedians were really having a field day with Dick Cheney shooting the poor old 80-year-old guy. Anyway, random stuff. Yes, I have lots of random stuff in my head. So Hamilton is partially in charge of this. And this was such a popular piece of literature that it was read in Congress every year, clear until World War I, where they stopped reading it. We'll talk about why in a minute. So what did it emphasize? The necessity and importance of national union. Yep. The value of the Constitution and the rule of law, the evils of political parties, and the proper virtues of a Republican people, and there are quite a few of them that he goes through. And then finally, of course, he hopes to avoid foreign entanglements. And this, of course, is because the United States is a young nation. We're involved with other countries. Then oftentimes you're dragged into war. They stopped reading this at World War I. Why do you think? Because when you have George Washington speaking to you from the grave saying, don't get involved in foreign nations, it doesn't work when you want to get involved with wars and foreign nations. And we never started reading it again. So yeah, anyway, there you have it. Okay, and then finally, I think this is maybe the most important thing in George Washington's presidency. Yes, he did keep us out of war. Yes, he did try to pull factions together. He wasn't completely successful at that. But he was so popular, he could have been king. He could have basically put himself into the position of power and stayed there. But he decided to step down. Very rare in the history of the world before George Washington. In fact, it never happened. Once someone comes to power, they never leave. And yet George Washington willingly stepped down, setting a great precedent for our country. And that precedent after 2 terms was unbroken clear until Franklin Roosevelt, and there are special circumstances there that we'll talk about later. Okay, so there you guys have it, George Washington. Next time we'll talk a bit about John Adams. But before we go, I want to play for you guys a song. You guys are going to love this song. This was our first national anthem. Let me make sure that our sound is shared. Yes, it is.
Hail Columbia, happy land. Hail ye heroes, heaven-born band, who fought and bled in freedom's cause, who fought and bled in freedom's cause. And when the storm of war was come, enjoyed the peace your valor won. Let independence be our boast, ever mindful what it cost, ever grateful for the prize. Let its altar reach the skies.
You guys notice all that religious imagery? The altar of freedom, Hail Columbia, the female Roman goddess. It gets weirder.
When united, let us be, rallying around our liberty. As a band of brothers join, peace and
George Washington has equal skill and godlike power. You guys hear the words? Whoa!
All the war guides with these, the happier times of honest peace. Firm united
All right, guys, it's been a fun class period. We'll see you next Thursday.
as up and down the sky, peace and safety we shall find.
Just pushing back the chapter a little bit. So technically it's going to be due for you on this coming Thursday, chapter 9. However, I'm giving you full credit if you don't get around to taking it until Sunday night at midnight. So there you go. Okay, but for class, we'll be taking a 1-question quiz over Morton Borden's article on Jefferson. It's 10 pages, so be ready for that this coming Thursday, 2 days. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.